Vertaken stood at the observation deck of the Kethmari flagship and watched the stars bend around them as the fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel. And before him stretched the gray and barren moon called Etheirys 7, home to the newest species foolish enough to reject Kethmari rule. He was old, older than most of his kind would ever live to be, and he had served the Dominion for over 600 years as an observer, a role that required him to watch and record and remember. And in all those centuries, he had witnessed the extinction of more than 300 sentient species. The Kethmari did not call them wars because wars implied two sides with a chance of victory. And what the Dominion conducted were not wars, but cullings, necessary cleansings of species too stubborn or too stupid to submit to the natural order of the galaxy. He turned from the viewport and walked to his private chamber where the data files on this new species awaited him. And he settled into his resting pod and activated the holographic display with a wave of his four-fingered hand. Humans, they called themselves. The display showed him images of their homeworld, a blue and green sphere they named Earth. And he studied their bodies with the clinical detachment of a scientist examining bacteria under a lens. They were soft creatures, wrapped in thin skin that tore easily and bled red when broken. And they possessed no natural armor, no venomous glands, no psychic abilities, no regenerative capabilities worth mentioning. And their bones were fragile things that shattered under pressure. Their lifespans were laughably short, barely a century for the luckiest among them. And most died far younger from disease or accident or simple decay. And Vertaken found himself wondering how such a species had ever crawled out of the mud of their birth world. He scrolled through more data and learned that they required constant intake of food and water, that they needed to shut down their consciousness for hours every day in something called sleep, that their bodies failed in extreme temperatures, that they suffocated without a specific mixture of gases, and that they reproduced slowly and raised their young for nearly 2 decades before those young could survive on their own. Everything about them screamed weakness, and Vertaken had seen dozens of species like them before. Soft things that burned bright for a moment and then vanished into the archive of silence where the Kethmari kept records of every species they had ended. He closed the display and felt something close to pity for these humans, for they had no idea what was coming for them. And by the time the Dominion fleet finished its work, there would be nothing left of their kind but data files and preserved specimens. The door to his chamber opened and Fleet Commander Kethvern entered, his armored carapace gleaming under the ship's lights. And he inclined his head in greeting. "Observer Vertaken, we will make planetfall within 6 hours. And the Supreme Council wishes to know if you require any special accommodations for your documentation duties." Vertaken rose from his pod and stretched his limbs, feeling the familiar ache of centuries in his joints. "I require nothing special, Commander, for this will be a simple extermination like all the others. And I expect to have my initial report completed before the second moon rises over that barren rock." Kethvern made a sound that passed for laughter among their kind. "You have grown confident in your old age, Observer, but perhaps too confident, for these humans have refused 3 separate offers of submission, and they have fortified their colony in ways our scouts did not anticipate." Vertaken waved a dismissive hand. "Every species resists at first, Commander, for it is in the nature of living things to cling to life even when that life is forfeit. But resistance and victory are not the same thing. And I have never seen a species survive once the full might of the Dominion turns upon them." He walked to the viewport again and stared at Etheirys 7 growing larger as the fleet approached. "Tell me about their defenses." Kethvern activated his own display and began reading from the scout reports. "They have constructed underground bunker networks beneath their primary settlement, which they call Colony Aurelian, and they have armed their civilians alongside their soldiers. And they have planted explosive devices throughout the surrounding terrain. And they have positioned their few orbital weapons in a defensive formation. Around the moon, Vortaken listened and felt nothing but amusement. And how many of them are there? Approximately 12,000, including non-combatants. And how many do we bring? 50,000 warriors of the Dominion, plus support personnel, plus the bioweapon division, plus the psychic warfare unit, plus orbital bombardment capabilities sufficient to crack the moon itself if necessary. Vortaken nodded slowly. Then this will not be a battle, Commander, but a demonstration. And I suggest you tell your warriors not to waste ammunition on creatures who are already dead. The fleet entered orbit around Etheris 7, and the first dropships began their descent, carrying the elite advance forces who would establish a beachhead and begin the systematic destruction of human resistance. Vortaken watched from the observation deck as the ships disappeared into the thin atmosphere, and he began composing the opening lines of his report in his mind. Already certain of how this story would end, he had seen this play out hundreds of times before. The desperate last stand of a doomed species. The futile resistance that always crumbled under Kethmari might. The silence that followed when the killing was done. And he expected nothing different from these fragile, short-lived creatures who called themselves human. 6 hours passed. The first reports should have arrived within 2 hours of landing. Standard updates on enemy positions and initial casualty estimates and projected timeline for a complete pacification. But the communication channels remained silent. Vortaken contacted the bridge. Commander Kethvarn, I am receiving no data from the advance forces, and I require updates for my documentation. There was a long pause before Kethvarn responded, and when he did, his voice carried an emotion that Vortaken had not heard from a Kethmari commander in over a century. Observer, we have lost contact with the advance forces. What do you mean, lost contact? I mean they are not responding, Observer. And the last transmission we received was a distress signal that cut off mid-sentence. And when we attempted to reach the secondary team, we found their channels silent as well. Vortaken felt something cold move through his body, something he barely recognized after so many centuries. It was confusion. Send reconnaissance drones to their last known position and report what you find. He returned to the viewport and stared at the moon below. And for the first time in 600 years, he wondered if perhaps he had made an error in his assessment. The drones reached the landing zone 30 minutes later, and when their visual feeds activated on the bridge display, Vortaken heard something he had never heard before in all his years of service. He heard Kethmari warriors gasp in horror. The advance forces were dead. All of them, their bodies scattered across the gray soil of Etheris 7. And among them lay human bodies too, far fewer than the Kethmari dead. And the blood that stained the ground was both purple and red. Vortaken stared at the carnage and felt the cold thing in his chest grow colder. Something was wrong here. Something he did not understand, and for the first time in centuries, he began to wonder if the humans might not be quite as dead as he had assumed. I saw humans bleed in battle and understood why even death retreats. Vortaken descended to the surface of Etheris 7 against the advice of Commander Kethvarn, who insisted that an observer had no place on an active battlefield. But Vortaken had not survived 6 centuries by hiding on ships, while others did the dying. The dropship touched down 3 kilometers from the ruins of what had once been Colony Aurelian, and Vortaken stepped onto alien soil with a data recorder in one hand and a pulse pistol in the other. Though he had not fired a weapon in over 200 years, the air smelled of smoke and something else. Something copper-like that he would later learn was the scent of human blood. He walked toward the last known position of the Kethmari advance forces. accompanied by a security detail of 12 warriors who moved with weapons raised and eyes scanning every shadow. And the silence around them was heavier than any silence Vortaken had experienced on any world. In any war, they found the first bodies half a kilometer from the landing. Zone HFY warriors lay scattered across the gray stone, their armor pierced and their blood pooling in purple rivers between the rocks. And Vortaken knelt beside one of them and studied the wounds with growing unease. These were not the clean kills of superior technology or overwhelming force. These were desperate kills. Messy kills, the kind of kills that happened when two opponents fought at close range with no regard for their own survival. And the HFY had clearly been surprised by the ferocity of the attack. Found the first human body 20 meters further on. It was a male. Young by human standards, wearing simple combat armor that had been torn open by HFY claws. And he lay on his back with his dead eyes staring at the gray sky above, but his hand still gripped his weapon. And around him lay 3 HFY warriors who had died trying to reach him. Vortaken recorded the scene and moved on. And with each step he took, he found more evidence of a battle that should not have been possible. He found a human female pinned under a fallen piece of debris, a lower body crushed beyond any hope of survival, and from the marks in the dust around her, he could see that she had dragged herself 3 meters after being wounded, had positioned herself behind a rock, and had continued firing until her ammunition ran out. And the 2 HFY bodies in front of her position told him that even then she had not stopped fighting. Found a group of 5 humans who had formed a circle with their backs together, protecting a wounded comrade in the center. And they had died together in that formation. Surrounded by 7 times their number in HFY dead, he found a medic, identifiable by the red cross on her armor, who had been shot twice in the chest and had still managed to finish bandaging another soldier's wounds before she finally collapsed. Vortaken stopped walking and stood in the middle of the carnage and tried to understand what he was seeing. The HFY had killed many humans, yes, but the humans had killed just as many HFY, and that should not have been possible. Not against warriors who were stronger and faster and better armored and better armed. What were these creatures? He heard weapons fire in the distance and moved toward the sound, his security detail forming a protective circle around him. And they crested a small hill and looked down into a valley where a different kind of battle was still raging. The humans had established a defensive position at the mouth of a cave system, using rubble and wrecked vehicles as cover. And the HFY were assaulting their position in waves. And Vortaken watched the battle unfold with eyes that had witnessed 300 extinctions. He saw a human soldier with a leg wound so severe that the bone showed white through the torn flesh. And this soldier was still fighting from behind a piece of rubble, still firing his weapon, still shouting orders to those around him. He saw another human whose face had been burned by plasma fire, the eyes gone, the skin melted. And this human was being guided by a companion who held his shoulder with one hand and fired with the other. And together they moved as one unit. The blind soldier reloading weapons while the other aimed and shot. He saw a young woman take a hit meant for an older male beside her, throwing herself into the path of the projectile without hesitation. And as she fell, she pushed him behind cover and screamed at him to keep fighting. They bled. These humans, they bled constantly and freely, their red blood staining everything they touched. And their bodies were failing in ways that would have killed any HFY warrior instantly. And yet they did not stop. Vortaken had seen courage before. For every species produced individuals willing to fight for survival. But this was something different. This was not just courage. This was something the HFY language had no word for. Something that looked like madness but felt like something else entirely. And as he watched these broken, bleeding creatures refuse to die, he felt the first stirring of an emotion he had not experienced in 400 years. It was fear. The battle ended when Kethmari reinforcements arrived and overwhelmed the human position through sheer numbers. But Vortaken noticed that his warriors did not celebrate their victory. They stood among the human dead with expressions that looked almost like shame. And when he ordered them to count the bodies, the numbers told a story that should have been impossible. 47 humans had held that position. They had killed 112. Kethmari before they fell, the security detail led. Vortaken through the cave system the humans had been defending, and they found evidence of a much larger force that had retreated deeper underground when the position became untenable. They also found Vortaken's humans found him. Rather, they emerged from the shadows with weapons raised and voices barking in their strange language. And before the security detail could react, they had neutralized half of them with precise shots and surrounded the rest. Vortaken raised his hands in the gesture of surrender that was universal across all spacefaring species and waited for the killing blow that he was certain would follow, but it did not come. The humans took his weapons and bound his hands and led him deeper into the caves. And when he stumbled on the uneven ground, one of them caught his arm and steadied him. And when they reached a small chamber lit by emergency lights, they sat him on a rock and gave him water. He stared at the container they offered him and did not understand. "You are not going to kill me?" One of the humans, a male with a wound on his forehead that was still bleeding, looked at him with eyes that held exhaustion and pain and something else that Vortaken could not name. "You're a prisoner, not a target, and we don't execute prisoners." Vortaken drank the water and felt his confusion grow deeper. "I am Kethmari, and my people are here to exterminate your species, and you give me water?" The human with the bleeding forehead smiled, and it was a smile that held no joy, but also no hatred. "Yeah, well, that's the difference between us and you, I guess. And maybe that's why we're still fighting." He walked away and left Vortaken, sitting in the dim light of the underground chamber, surrounded by enemies who had every reason to kill him, and did note Vortaken sat there for a long time, thinking about what he had seen, thinking about the bleeding soldiers who refused to die, thinking about the water they had given him. And he began to wonder if perhaps the Dominion had made a terrible mistake in coming to this moon. These creatures were not like any species he had observed before. They were soft and fragile and mortal, and they knew it. And they fought anyway. And when they captured their enemies, they gave them water instead of death. What kind of species did that? What kind of madness drove them? And as he sat there in the darkness, Vortaken began to realize that he had no idea how to write this report, because nothing in 600 years of experience had prepared him for what he was seeing. The underground bunkers beneath Colony Aurelian stretched for kilometers in every direction, a maze of tunnels and chambers that the humans had carved into the rock over years of preparation. And Vortaken spent 3 days as their prisoner, watching them prepare for the end they all knew was coming. They did not treat him with cruelty, though he had expected cruelty, and they did not treat him with fear, though he represented the species that had come to destroy them. They treated him with something that confused him more than hatred ever could. They treated him with indifference, as if he were simply another problem to manage among many problems. And they went about their preparations without paying him much attention at all. He observed them carefully, recording everything with his memory since they had taken his data device. And what he saw challenged everything he thought he knew about prey species facing extinction. The soldiers moved through the tunnels with quiet efficiency, checking weapons and counting ammunition and reinforcing defensive positions. And Vortaken noticed that none of them had slept more than a few hours and days. Their commanding officer was a woman named Yara Okonkwo, a colonel by their military rankings. And she moved among her people with a presence that reminded Vortaken of the greatest Kethmari warlords he had observed in his long life. She had not slept at all. As far as he could tell, She walked the tunnels constantly, speaking with soldiers and civilians alike, checking supplies and adjusting plans, and somehow finding the energy to smile at children who looked up at her with frightened eyes on the second day of his captivity. She came to speak with him directly. She sat on a rock across from him and studied his face with dark eyes that held exhaustion but no despair. And when she spoke, her voice was calm and steady. "You're the observer, aren't you? The one who writes the reports when a species dies?" Vortaken inclined his head in acknowledgement. "I am, and I have written such reports for over 600 years. She nodded slowly. "So you've watched a lot of species die, more than 300. And you think you're going to watch us die too?" It was not a question, but Vortaken answered it anyway. "The mathematics are simple, Colonel, for you are fewer than 3,000 now, and the Dominion has 40,000 warriors on this moon, and your supplies are limited while ours are endless." She smiled at that, and it was a smile that held something he could not identify. "Yeah, the math is pretty bad. I won't argue with that. Then why do you continue to fight?" She was silent for a long moment, and when she answered, her voice was softer than before. "Do you know what my daughter asked me before I deployed here?" Vortaken did not respond, and she continued without waiting for an answer. "She asked me if I was scared. And I told her yes, I was scared. And then she asked me why I was going if I was scared. And I didn't have a good answer for her then." She looked at the rock ceiling above them, where the sound of distant explosions occasionally vibrated through the stone. "I think I have an answer now, though. And the answer is that some things matter more than being scared. And some things matter more than dying. And if we just lay down and let you walk over us, then everything we ever built, and everything we ever loved, and everything we ever dreamed about just disappears. And I can't let that happen. But it will happen anyway, Colonel, for you cannot win this battle." She laughed, and it was the strangest laugh Vortaken had ever heard, full of exhaustion and sadness, and something that sounded almost like peace. Maybe not. "Observer, but here's the thing you don't understand about humans. And it's this. We don't fight because we think we'll win. We fight because fighting is what we do. Because standing up when everything tells us to lie down is who we are. And because tomorrow might be different." She stood and looked down at him with those dark, tired eyes. "And if tomorrow isn't different, if we all die down here in these tunnels, then at least we made you work for it. And at least someone will remember that we existed." She walked away, and Vortaken sat in the dim light and thought about her words that night. The Kethmari launched their assault on the tunnel network. They came with acid fog that dissolved metal and flesh alike. And the humans sealed sections of the tunnels and sacrificed space to slow the advance. They came with hunter drones that crawled through the smallest openings. And the humans destroyed them with traps and improvised explosives and bare hands when nothing else worked. They came with psychic screamers, devices that projected waves of terror directly into the minds of their targets. And Vortaken watched from his cell as humans screamed and wept and clutched their heads in agony. And then he watched those same humans wipe their tears and pick up their weapons and return to their positions. One soldier, a young man who could not have been more than 20 years old by human counting, came to check on Vortaken during a lull in the fighting. His hands were shaking from the effects of the psychic weapons, and there was vomit on his uniform and his eyes were red from crying. But he stood at his post and did his duty. Vortaken asked him why he did not run. The young man looked at him with eyes that held fear, real and visible fear. And he said something that Vortaken would remember for the rest of his very long life. "Because the people behind me are counting on me. And because my mom taught me that being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means being scared and doing the right thing anyway. And right now, the right thing is standing here. So here I am." He shrugged, as if it were the simplest thing in the world, and returned to watching the tunnel entrance on the third day. A dying soldier was carried past Vortaken's cell. The soldier was an older man with gray in his hair and a wound in his stomach that was clearly fatal. And the medics who carried him were trying to save him even though everyone could see there was no hope. The dying man grabbed one of the medics by the arm and pulled her close. And Vortaken heard him speak in a voice that bubbled with blood. "Stop wasting supplies on me. I'm done. But listen, you have to tell my daughter something when this is over." The medic was crying, but she nodded and leaned closer. "Tell her I thought about her. At the end, tell her I love her. Tell her I'm sorry I won't be there to see her graduate. And tell her to be brave, okay? Tell her to be brave." He died with those words on his lips. And the medic stood over his body for a moment in silence before they covered his face and moved on to the next wounded soldier. Vortaken sat in his cell and felt something he had not felt in centuries. Something wet on his face, and he raised his hand to his cheek and found moisture there. He was crying. Vortaken, observer of the Kethmari Dominion, witness to 300 extinctions, was crying for a species he had been sent to watch die. Colonel Okonkwo found him like that. And she stood in the entrance to his cell and watched him for a moment before she spoke. "The final assault comes at dawn, and we're going to make our last stand on the surface, where we have more room to fight." Vortaken looked up at her with wet eyes. "You will all die, probably, but we'll die standing, and that matters to us." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small data device. "I'm releasing you before the battle, and I want you to take this with you, and it contains recordings, testimonies, names and faces of everyone who fought here, and I want someone to remember us when we're gone." She pressed the device into his hands. Someone should remember. Vortaken took the device and held it like it was the most precious thing in the universe. And in that moment, he thought perhaps it was, "I will remember." "Colonel, I promise you that." She smiled. And for a moment she looked almost peaceful. "Then we've already won. Observer, because as long as someone remembers, we're never really gone." She walked away to prepare for the final battle. And Vortaken sat in the darkness with human tears on his alien face and wondered how he had ever thought these creatures were weak. The dawn came gray and cold over Aetherius 7, and Vortaken stood on a ridge overlooking the valley where the final battle would be fought. And he watched the humans emerge from their tunnels to meet their end. They numbered fewer than 300 now, these last defenders of Colony Aurelian, and they formed a line across the valley floor with the ruins of their settlement at their backs. The Kethmari came with 10,000 warriors of the Annihilator Corps, the elite of the elite, soldiers bred and trained for the sole purpose of ending species. And they formed ranks on the opposite side of the valley like a purple sea of death. Vortaken should have felt satisfaction at the sight, should have felt the familiar comfort of watching the natural order reassert itself. But instead he felt only a deep and terrible sadness. He clutched the data device the colonel had given him and whispered a promise to the cold air. "I will remember." The battle began with a Kethmari charge. 10,000 warriors surging forward with weapons blazing and war cries echoing across the stone. And the human line did not waver. They opened fire with everything they had. And Vortaken watched Kethmari warriors fall by the hundreds as the humans fought with a precision and fury that should have been impossible for such a small force. The first wave broke against the human line like water against rock, and the survivors pulled back to regroup. And Vortaken saw something in the eyes of the retreating warriors that he had never seen before. He saw doubt. The second wave came with heavier weapons and more warriors, and this time they pushed the humans back, meter by bloody meter, and Vortaken watched the human line bend but not break. He saw a soldier with both legs shattered below the knee drag himself to a firing position and continue shooting until a Kethmari blade finally silenced him. He saw two soldiers share their last ammunition. counting rounds and deciding together which shots mattered most. And when the bullets ran out, they drew knives and charged forward together. He saw a medic working on a wounded soldier under fire, hands steady and movements precise, even as plasma bolts struck the ground around her. And when a HFY warrior reached her position, she killed him with a scalpel before returning to her patient. The second wave retreated, and Vortaken counted the bodies on the field. And the numbers made no sense. The HFY had lost over 1,000 warriors, and the humans had lost perhaps 50. How is this possible? These were not superior soldiers with superior weapons and superior training. These were frightened, exhausted, outnumbered creatures who should have collapsed hours ago. And yet, they stood. The third wave was the worst. The HFY commanders, frustrated and humiliated, committed everything at once, sending warriors in from all directions, overwhelming the human line through sheer mass. And still, the humans did not break. Vortaken watched a man strap explosives to his chest and walk into a formation of HFY warriors. And he watched the explosion take a dozen of them with him. He watched soldiers form walls with their bodies, standing shoulder to buy seconds for others to reload. And he watched them fall one by one and be replaced by others who stepped forward without hesitation. He watched a sniper with a severed arm prop her rifle on her own knee and continue firing with her remaining hand, picking off HFY officers with shots that should have been impossible from such a distance. He watched them bleed. These impossible creatures watched their red blood soak the gray stone beneath their feet, watched their bodies break in 100 different ways. And still they fought. The battle lasted 9 hours, 9 hours. When it should have lasted minutes, 9 hours of constant combat, of killing and dying and bleeding, of humans who refused to accept what the universe was trying to tell them. The HFY broke 3 times. 3 separate retreats to regroup and recover. And each time Vortaken saw the doubt in their eyes grow deeper. They were not afraid of dying, these HFY warriors. For death was a known thing, a natural thing, a thing that came for all living creatures in time. But they were afraid of the humans. They were afraid of creatures who would not stop, who could not be intimidated, who looked death in the face and spit in its eye and kept fighting. Vortaken watched the final moments of the battle from his ridge, his eyes fixed on Colonel Yara Okonkwo. She was the last one standing. Her soldiers lay around her, dead or dying, and she stood alone in the center of a circle of HFY bodies, her rifle empty and her pistol empty, and nothing left in her hands but a standard issue combat knife. The HFY surrounded her, hundreds of them, and they did not attack. They just stood there, watching her. And Vortaken understood that they were afraid to approach. She should have been easy prey. This single wounded human with nothing but a knife. But she stood like a creature made of fire and iron and something the HFY had no name for. She raised the knife and screamed at them, words that Vortaken could not hear but could somehow understand. Come and get me. She was saying, come and get me, you cowards. I'm not finished yet. A HFY warrior finally stepped forward, a massive specimen of their species, one of the elite of the elite. And he raised his weapon and pointed it at her chest. She did not flinch. She raised her knife higher and took a step toward him. And for a moment, Vortaken thought the warrior would retreat, but the moment passed, and the weapon fired and Colonel Yara Okonkwo fell beside her soldiers. The battle was over. The humans had lost. And yet, as Vortaken looked at the battlefield below, at the thousands of HFY bodies mixed with the hundreds of human dead, he knew that something fundamental had changed. He descended from the ridge and walked among the dead. And he noticed that the HFY warriors would not look at the human bodies. They collected their own dead with quick, nervous movements, and they avoided stepping too close to the fallen humans. And when their work was done, they retreated from the battlefield as quickly as they could. Vortaken found Colonel Okonkwo's body and knelt beside her. Her eyes were still open, staring at the gray sky. And there was something on her face that looked almost like a smile. He reached out and closed her eyes with a gesture. He had learned from watching human medics treat their dead. "I will remember you," he whispered. "I will remember all of you, and I will make sure the galaxy knows what you did here." He stood and looked at the data device in his hand. The recording of names and faces that she had trusted in to carry death had come for these humans, and death had won in the end, as death always does. But death had not taken them easily. Death had worked for every single soul on this battlefield. It paid a price that no species in 300 extinctions had ever made it pay before, and as Vortaken walked away from the field of the dead, he understood something that would haunt him for the rest of his long life. The humans had lost this battle, but they had not been defeated. There is a difference, he realized, between losing and being defeated, and the humans had shown him that difference in blood and fire and the kind of courage that should not exist in such fragile creatures. He would carry their story with him, and he would tell it to anyone who would listen, and someday, perhaps, the Kethmari would understand why he had seen humans bleed in battle and felt not contempt but awe. 60 years had passed since the Battle of Aetheris 7, and Vortaken stood in the great hall of the Kethmari Dominion Council as the oldest living observer in the history of their species. His body had grown old and slow. His carapace faded from deep purple to gray, and his movements were careful and measured in the way of all ancient things. But his mind remained sharp, and his memory remained perfect, and he remembered every moment of that battle. As if it had happened yesterday, the council had summoned him to advise on what they called the human question, the problem of a species that refused to die. Despite every effort to exterminate them, the High Counselor, a young specimen named Kethvern, who had never witnessed a true culling in his life, spread his hands in frustration as he addressed the assembly. "We have won every battle against these humans. Every single engagement has resulted in their defeat. And yet their territory expands, their population grows, and they show no signs of surrender or submission." Vortaken listened in silence as the other counselors offered their opinions. "Send more ships," one suggested. "Overwhelm them with numbers. Deploy the bioweapons," another offered. "Attack their homeworld directly. Use the psychic warfare division," a third recommended. "Break their minds before their bodies." Vortaken had heard these suggestions before. 60 years ago, when the Dominion had first decided to exterminate humanity, and he knew how little they understood. When the other counselors had finished speaking, the High Counselor turned to Vortaken with the dismissive patience that the young often showed to the old observer. "Vortaken, you were present at Aetheris 7, the first major engagement with this species, and we would hear your assessment." Vortaken rose slowly from his seat and walked to the center of the great hall, where a holographic display showed the current map of human-controlled space. 60 years ago, that space had been a single colony on a barren moon. Now it stretched across 3 star systems and contained billions of souls. He studied the map for a long moment before he spoke. "I was at Aetheris 7. Yes, and I watched 300 humans hold against 10,000 Kethmari warriors for 9 hours. And I watched them inflict casualties that our military historians still refuse to believe." He turned to face the council. "Since that day, one have studied this species with the dedication of 6 decades. And I have read every report from every engagement. And I have spoken with survivors from every campaign. And I have reached conclusions that I fear this council does not wish to hear." The High Counselor made a dismissive gesture. "We are prepared to hear all perspectives, observer, even those that may be uncomfortable." Vortaken nodded slowly. "Then hear this. The humans cannot be exterminated. Not by us, not by any force in this galaxy. And every attempt to destroy them will only make them stronger. The chamber erupted in sounds of disbelief and outrage. And the High Counselor raised his hand for silence. "Explain this absurd claim, observer, for it contradicts everything we know about inferior species." Vortaken reached into his robe and withdrew the data device that Colonel Conquo had given him 60 years ago. The device that held the names and faces of every human who had died at Aetheris 7. I have carried this with me for 6 decades, and I have watched it every day, and I have learned things about humanity that no Kethmari has ever understood. He activated the device, and the faces of the dead appeared in the air before him, men and women and children, soldiers and civilians, all of them gone now. All of them remembered. These creatures live for less than a century, and they know it, and that knowledge does not make them afraid. It makes them dangerous in ways we cannot comprehend. He walked among the holographic faces, pointing to each one in turn. They do not fear death, not because they are too stupid to understand it, but because they have made peace with it. Because they know that their time is short, and so every moment matters, every breath matters, every choice matters. He stopped before the image of Colonel Okonkwo and stared at her face with something that looked almost like reverence. This woman knew she was going to die, and she knew her people were going to die. And she fought anyway, not for victory, but for meaning. Not for survival, but for the chance to matter. He turned back to the council. "Do you understand what that means? Do you understand what it means to fight an enemy who has already accepted their death before the battle begins?" The High Counselor shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "They are still mortal. Observer, and mortal creatures can be killed. Yes, they can be killed one by one, world by world. But they reproduce faster than we can kill them, and they spread further than we can chase them. And every death we inflict upon them becomes a story that their survivors tell to their children." He gestured at the map of human space. "Every colony we burned became a rallying cry. Every battle we won became a legend of human resistance. Every human who died fighting became a hero whose name is carved into monuments across their territory." Vortaken walked toward the council table, his old body straightening with the weight of what he was about to say. "They remember. High Counselor, that is their secret weapon. That is the thing we never understood. They remember everything. Every death, every loss, every moment of pain. And they pass those memories to their children, who pass them to their children, who pass them to their children." He placed his hands on the table and leaned forward. "We have given them 60 years of memories. 60 years of stories about Kethmari cruelty. 60 years of reasons to hate us and fight us and never, ever stop." The chamber was silent now, and Vortaken could see the first stirrings of understanding in some of the younger counselors' eyes. "My recommendation, which I made 60 years ago and make again today, is simple. Leave them alone. Do not engage them. Do not provoke them. Do not give them any more reasons to remember our name." He pulled out a datapad and read aloud the words he had written 6 decades ago. "Standing in human blood on a barren moon. Recommendation: reclassify species human from prey to existential. Do not engage. Do not provoke. Do not allow them reason to remember your name." He looked up at the council. "I watched them bleed. Watched their bodies fail in ways our kind cannot imagine. And I understood at last the secret the universe has kept from us. Death does not claim them because death cannot catch them. They run toward it. They drag others away from it. They spit in its face and laugh and weep and bleed. And they do not stop." He straightened and met the High Counselor's eyes. "They are not brave because they do not fear. They are brave because they fear everything and choose to stand anyway. And that is something we can never defeat, no matter how many ships we send, no matter how many weapons we deploy." He paused and spoke his final words with the weight of 600 years behind him. "Leave them alone. For if you give humans something to die for, they become something that cannot be killed. the council dismissed his recommendation as cowardice. As the fearful rambling of an old observer who had lost his nerve, they voted to launch a new extermination campaign, targeting Earth itself this time, committing the full might of the Dominion to the destruction of humanity. Vortaken left the council chamber knowing that he would not live to see the consequences of their decision, but knowing also what those consequences would be 60 years after that council meeting. The Kethmari Dominion was a memory, scattered and broken. Its homeworld occupied by human forces, its survivors scattered across the galaxy as refugees and exiles, and in the ruins of the Great Hall where the council had once met, human archaeologists discovered the Archive of Silence, the repository of every species the Kethmari had ever exterminated. They found records of over 300 sentient civilizations, entire peoples reduced to data files and preserved specimens, and they wept for species they had never known. And at the end of the archive, in a special section that had been sealed for over a century, they found Vortaken's report from Aetheris 7. It was the only document in the archive that did not record an extinction. Instead, it recorded a warning, a plea from an old observer who had seen humans bleed in battle and understood something that his people never did. The humans read the report and copied it and spread it across their growing territory, and it became one of their most treasured documents, a testament from an enemy who had seen them at their worst and their best. And the final line of that report, the line that Vortaken had written with human blood still drying on the stones around him, became a motto that humanity carried with them to every new world they settled. I saw humans bleed in battle, and I understood why even death retreats, not because they are strong, but because they are mortal, not because they cannot die, but because they have chosen to live. And there is nothing in the universe more terrifying than a creature who has something worth dying for. The humans remembered Vortaken, and they remembered the Colonel, and they remembered everyone who had fought and died on that barren moon 60 years and then another. 60 years ago, they always remembered. That was their secret, that was their strength, that was why death itself learned to retreat before them.